Okay, so today's kind of a wild day. We're going to start with, there's no working sessions today. It's really a deep dive into what we're offering, the system we're building, and the underlying infrastructure, why we need to build it. Oh, sorry, it's okay. I don't know, Jeff, did you want to dive into the full system? You want to do the quick explainer, or do you want me to?
I can. Let me just pull it up on the screen and share it here real quick. So it's up for the live stream.
So we'll just do like a quick 5-minute intro of the whole overview, and then we are kind of doing it in a weird order where we do Giveth first and then the analytics dashboard, just because of logistics with coordinating with everyone. But it's gonna be a long day today, guys. So get ready to be like in school.
Okay, can I get a full system diagram, and then maybe we'll just zoom in on component by component?
Sure.
Okay, so this diagram is the full cyber physical commons system. This is actually this is probably more than what we will actually be doing in our first run. This includes things like Harburger taxes and whatnot. So anyway, don't worry if the detail of the diagram is pretty in depth. So all of this actually represents how this is wired together in categories. So this is actually, you can look at this almost like a circuit diagram.
Okay, it's burned.
Okay. Actually, go back to the other one. Yeah, that's better. So everything outside of the box is our normal economy. So this is the outside economy. Money can enter through different ways, and also value is produced within this economy and goes back to the outside economy. So the token bonding curve is kind of everything, is the border around the black area here. Conviction voting is in purple. The Giveth DApp is in green. So we'll walk through kind of how this would most likely be used. Money comes in from the outside economy. It mints and burns into the token bonding curve. Tokens are created. Those tokens are used to vote on proposals, or not vote, but broadcast preference. So here's a list of proposals that are all gathering conviction. Once they hit a certain trigger value within conviction voting, money flows to the proposals through the Giveth framework. These are the pools of DAI that are per each proposal. When milestone is complete, the laborers are paid back through rebonded DAI. So it's not just here's your DAI from the funding pool. It's rebonded into the augmented bonding curve for all of the positive feedback effects that brings. And they're minted tokens. If they want to have 50% tokens, 50% DAI from their work, that can be set beforehand. That's just a quick atomic swap. We also have our reserve pool in the bonding curve here. So when money comes in, part goes to the reserve pool, and the other part goes into the funding pool, which is this it up here, Z?
Yeah.
Reserve funding. Yeah. So whenever you exit the bonding curve, you pay an exit tax, which we are working on some alternative names for because we're trying to avoid the word tax. Goes into the funding pool. And of course, the funding pool is what funds all these proposals in the Giveth DApp.
It's really just a friction. I know we're still working on terminology, but the idea here is that this is actually a contained circular economy inside of it, and that the ebb and flow across the bonding curve, it's sort of like a permissible boundary. So Jeff and I have talked about this like almost like a cell wall, where there's the fact that there's a friction through crossing that boundary is part of what makes the cell cohesive. Essentially, value can flow into it by osmosis, but to leave, it has to overcome a certain energy or there's a certain loss, and that's actually what makes it in some ways makes it biomimetic, is that we have this notion of a permeable and not fixed boundary, but one that is still a cohesive boundary, precisely because this metabolism that we've described with the production of labor through completing of proposals doesn't immediately yield DAI, which means it doesn't pump the value out. It rebonds in order to keep that circular economy. And then essentially there's a secondary choice to translate it back into outside economy money. And while we do expect that to happen with some, rate, meaning maybe people need to take 50, 80% as revenue in order to cover their costs, we still want to sort of make it so that by default, the value is internal metabolism, and by choice it comes out. And that the exit tariff or the friction is there to actually codify that boundary, even if it's very small.
Right. So yeah, there's a couple different ways that money can enter. So the way we most often talk about is through the bonding curve. These are people that want to interact with governance. They want to interact with the whole economy. We can also just accept donations or grants straight into the funding pool. So, we've had this question before: why do I have to, buy into the bonding curve, and then you don't take an exit tax to feed the funding pool until I leave? Well, what if I want my money to be immediately useful in this commons? Okay, you can just donate your funds directly into the funding pool. That's also an acceptable action. This is the work that is completed from the milestones, and this produces value for the outside economy. So any products that are produced or any services that are produced by this commons that are useful, we can actually turn that into another source of revenue through Harburger tax or some kind of other ongoing.
And let me make a note about both donations and about the conviction bonding curve, is that for all that the yellow bar is on the right and it's seemingly outside of the system, it's important to recognize that the engine of this economy is actually the perceived or an interpreted value of the outside world of those yellow bars. It's what the community is accomplishing, whether it's taking care of a park or whether it's building open source software. It doesn't really matter. The key is that the value exchange at the organism level is that this organization or organism is taking in two things. One is capital in the form of grants or payments in exchange for the yellow outputs, and the other is capital in exchange for the right to steer. So it's like two variables. One is the influence, which is sort of in green, and one which is the money, which is in blue. But those two things, you can think of the blue and the green as mixing together to produce the yellow. The yellow is the real value output. And insofar as people continue to value the yellow output, you would expect them to essentially either give blue, DAI or fiat equivalent, or to, if they want to help steer, then they're going to use it to come in through the bonding curve. So they have two choices. They're different mechanisms. One is literally to say, yes, keep doing this, but I don't want to be steering. I just want you to keep doing what you're doing because I value what you're creating or maintaining, which is where we see donations and where we see the potential Harburger tax and other forms of revenue generation as a result of yellow, which is, just to be clear, is distinct from saying, hey, I actually want to participate in steering, which is where you come through the bonding curve to get green. Does this make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I ask a question, or should I?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Maybe I don't want to take us off topic, but Jeff has mentioned, and I think Zargan just mentioned again, the Harburger tax. I understand that concept in like broader.
There's nothing to do with Harburger tax in our value things. So
it's out of scope for the commons at this point.
Yeah.
I was trying to wrap
It's an example because people ask, like, what do you mean? How does this produce revenue? And the discount tokens, the Harburger tax, and others are things that we've quoted as examples of, designs that allow one to turn commons or club goods into revenues to maintain those goods, but we're not bringing them into scope for this project. But fortunately, this is a composable system. And so we're saying one could append these things without like significant overhead.
That could be another common stack component in the future, is implementing a Harburger tax or other revenue streams to value produced by the commons.
Right, but
So
not
that-
that scope of steps 1 through 6. So.
Right.
Just
So,
one more little question.
Sure.
Could you repeat one more time what the different ways are that money can come into the funding pool?
So into the funding pool. So when people purchase into the bonding curve, money doesn't go directly into the funding curve except in the hatch phase when the curve is live. When you purchase into the bonding curve or support the bonding curve and then exit the economy, so the exit tax feeds the the funding pool, and also donations. So you can donate directly to the funding pool.
So it's only once you sell, or
In the open phase, yes. In the hatch phase, when the curve is being initialized, theta percent, theta is just the variable we use, percent goes into the funding pool to initialize it.
that element is not visualized.
That's
No,
not here.
this is-
This is the steady state system. This is not the hatch. Yeah. So ultimately, what we're trying to do is design like biomimetic economy. So if you look at this as a cell, these are the inputs. This cell eats capital in the form of donations and contributions to the bonding curve, and it poops out work, whatever that work is. You know, planting trees, cleaning beaches, protecting rivers. So this is kind of an efficient economy. We're trying to reduce losses, which is why we have interesting mechanisms like rebonding the dye into the curve and then issuing it, because we want people to stay within the economy. We don't want them to exit when work is done. We don't just want to say, okay, here's your dye, get out of the economy. We say, okay, here's your trash hero coin. And if you value this economy and you want to grow your responsibility and governance and stake in this economy, you can keep your trash hero coin. But I mean, cash out your dye if you need to buy dinner, if you need to buy, pay your bills, whatever.
And I think one point I want to make here is that this is not expected to, this isn't really an and or. If you think of the tokens as being the nervous system and the money as being the sort of power or work or like this sort of, muscular energy of the system, the like ability to do stuff, then what you're basically saying is that every participant and actually the ecosystem as a whole is going to have a non-trivial distribution of value between the two. And that the idea is that someone who's participating is going to have a different preference profile between how much they want to be part of the nervous system and how much they just want to take the results. And it can be anything from some people choosing to take every cent that they earn for their labor as cash and not being part of the decision-making process, which would mean burning all the tokens they get for money. Or in the other extreme, someone who doesn't need money, who's really just in it to have this effect on the commons, would continue to accumulate sort of influence and not cash their tokens into money and anything in between. And the only thing that we've added is we've been careful about where the frictions are and intentionally put the frictions on one side, meaning turning influence into money has a friction, but turning money into influence doesn't. And while that imbalance is small, that's part of what helps the system trend in the direction we want it to. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I want to just like transition into the other things, but there's one piece that we're missing, which isn't really visible here, which is the analytics of the system, the actual like our fourth component, which is just kind of modeling this entire system and doing health, making sure that everything is working properly, and doing a lot of data analytics to judge the health of the system and just watch the whole thing flow. So, but we have these 4 parts: that analytics part, the augmented bonding curve, conviction voting, and the Giveth DApp. So we're going to transition into talking about the Giveth DApp first. Then we're going to go into the analytics of the entire system, which Z will lead. And then right before lunch, we'll dive into the bonding curve. Hopefully Jordy will get over here for that portion. He might miss the beginning. And then after lunch, we're going to talk about CAD, which is really the underlying foundation of that makes all of this possible. And then we're going to finish it off with conviction voting, which is that sexy DAO that we have. Max, can you flip on those lights?
Question.
Yeah.
So is there any more exhaustive like definition of terms besides the glossary doc? Jeff,
Sorry?
is there any place that's more, like a more thorough, definition of terms besides the glossary doc?
Straight definitions would be the glossary doc. All the terms are in the system overview, but not all of them have been switched over. Glossary is after everything else is finalized. The glossary and FAQ will.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
The question is, are all the terms defined yet? And the answer is not really.
Because like I sit here and I see trigger valve and it's like, I know that this is probably been explained, but I just like,
The names on those diagrams are all out of date.
Yeah.
They're all
Exit
out of date.
tax, trigger valve, yeah. I mean, we've been calling it the trigger function or,
It's not good. No. I bet this one's good. Oh yeah, look at that.
Lorelei, the only thing I would add is that a lot of the terms are technically open for discussion, and Jeff and the comms team are figuring out like messaging around them. So while the concepts are well defined, one of the reasons I think the docs might be not fully up to date is that some of these things, names matter. And so while the concept from a design perspective might not change, it still might be worth having minor discussions during this week about, what to call those things.
Yeah, if you have certain terms that does not make sense to me for this or that reason.
Definitely shout them out. They're a great venue to gather.
Yeah. But for now, keep diving, and
Yeah.
we can pull a lot of the terms out. We're gonna go through the whole system today, so
Maybe just jot it down.
there'll be
Notes afterwards. Yeah.
So the Giveth system really sits at the end of conviction voting, right? And from the original donor perspective, that's the end. But for the large majority of people that will interact with the system, it's actually the beginning. This is where people who are doing good work, that are actually trying to make an effect, like a physical effect on the world, and make the change, this is their entry point into our system. So it's the proposal framework. The Giveth app really acts as a proposal framework to request funds from the DAOs, from the commons. So when the user comes to Giveth, they're like, I have this great idea. I want to raise money for it, and I don't really care where it comes from. But I do know that there is this weird mechanism that somehow funds projects that help, let's say open source projects, right? So if you're an F2.0 researcher, you'll go to the Giveth app, you'll fill out your proposal, and your proposal for work that you want to do. You'll ask for how much money you want, and then you'll put it out there. Now, from a higher level, you don't care where the money comes from. You just want to get paid to do your research. So when you use the Giveth app, you can see exactly where your money goes when people donate to it. And the people who receive money can see who's giving them the money. There is no third party. So this is what allows for traceable donations, and it gives transparency and accountability on both sides. So when someone creates a proposal, they're probably going to have a reviewer or not, right? They're going to have lots of choices. And I don't necessarily want to go into the details of how we'll make those milestones. We'll figure that out. This is I guess it will be the third iteration of the Giveth app. So we have a lot of understanding and experience on how we're going to evolve this. But the main points are that we're going to maintain transparency and accountability. We're also going to maintain interoperability between commons and between the outside world. Yeah?
You said transparency and accountability in both directions just before that. Why they won't have any transparency on where the money really comes from if they don't get into that system. Right?
They will know. They'll be able to see where that it came from this commons, or that it came from that commons, or that it came from wherever. Whereas in the current nonprofit space, oh yeah, I got it from UNICEF. Where did they get it? I don't really know.
Okay.
You know?
So one point I would make is that there's a concept called provenance that I think is really important, and it refers to the history of money and how it's flown and flowed. But in this case, what we're saying is that because of the Giveth DApp and because of this broader framework, the provenance or the history of the flows is observable. That's not the same as saying that you have to see it or that you have to care about it. Think of it in reverse, like if I wanted to know, I could, which is different from throwing it in someone's face and demanding they pay attention to it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and I like Jeff's little drawing over here where it's like, you know, multiple people can donate, and you can even have outside donations go directly to these things. In fact, the real goal of including the Giveth DApp is to incentivize outside donations, because what will happen is once we have the full system, we'll have a proposal that looks like this, you know, the title of the proposal, you know, all the context, what they're doing, a picture, you know, the who, the how much, and the reviewer, if the reviewer exists. But then we'll have a little number up here that will say, maybe it says like 600 DAI, and this thing is asking for 1,000. So this is actually how much conviction voting power this proposal will have behind it.
What do you mean will have?
So
Like-
it's like a pledge. So it has it right now in the conviction voting framework, right? You'll have all these Giveth proposals that will be up there, and all these people will have been voting, right? So you know and a lot of people are voting on this one, and that equals 600 XDAI worth of power, right? Conviction voting power.
I guess what I'm asking is that like current, or is that like
Current.
if these people don't change their votes for 3 days, then I'll have.
It's
Like I currently have
it's
600.
in that moment,
Uh-huh.
right? We can actually define conviction voting, like the voting power, in monetary units. So we
Right,
can
right.
say this is 600 XDAI worth of voting power is behind this proposal right now. It's asking for 1,000. If someone donates 400,
Oh.
it will be matched immediately, and the milestone will be filled.
So that's these individual outside donations. It doesn't have to come through the Commons framework and conviction voting. Someone could just say, hey, I'm so close, this really needs to happen. I'm just gonna put in an individual outside donation, and
So-
it's all interoperable.
Right.
And this is a
That's my-
deterministic mathematical thing because the trigger function is known a priori. You can always compute the amount of dollars or DAI that would need to be donated in order to make it immediately pass. And so the idea is that you can have two ways, again, back influence versus money. You could buy a bunch more tokens and then vote and wait and see what happens. But if you really want something to happen because you just care about the outcome, there's still an incentive to just straight up throw down the money to get it done.
Yeah, and what were you gonna ask?
No, that's a great thing to know. And then I was going to ask on top of that, assuming that this example is my proposal, I'm asking for $1,000. I currently have 600 through the conviction voting process. Somebody else, like you said, just wants to see it happen, so they throw down 400. When that approval is triggered, do I then get 1,000 out of the funding pool or 600?
So what actually happens is this, now that you have this 400 and you have 600 XDAI from the Commons,
Mhm.
once you know that money is sitting there, there is like actually 1,000 XDAI sitting in this milestone right now.
Because the 600 got dumped over
yeah,
from the
the
other.
600 comes out of the
It
Commons,
does. Okay.
and it's sitting there. The 400 is sitting there, but then you have to do the work. So you know the money's there,
Right. And then
Escrow
it's
is
like
happening.
the Giveth process.
and now you do the work, and now you say, "Hey, I'm done. Right? Pay me." And the reviewer checks the work and says, "Yep, that looks great, man." Assuming that there's a reviewer, and then there is decision moment that you have to make as the recipient. You have 600 XDAI from the commons. That can be 600 XDAI worth of commons tokens.
Right.
Or it will be, let's say that just for ease of use, it's 10% tax. We have a huge tax on this one. Tribute. An exit tribute is the current. This is just a tribute. Gotta believe. So 10%. So this will be 540.
That's not a Sharpie.
We'll find out. Or 540 worth of XDAI. Because this commons has a relatively large tribute requirement. And of course 400 worth of XDAI. And I'm saying XDAI, in the end this is an implementation detail.
Right.
When we'll see, I assume that we're gonna use XDAI, but we have to coordinate all of those details together.
And to be clear, strictly speaking, I think because as I understand it, both that 600 XDAI and that 400 XDAI are going to be sitting in the same milestone in the Giveth DApp. So technically, they would have the choice for anything from, taking out 900 XDAI, or I guess you could say we don't tax them on the 400, but either way, they could even take all, in theory, we would want them to be allowed to take all 1,000 in commons tokens if they so chose.
Of course, absolutely. They will have that choice. Yeah.
Where is the 540 from the 600?
So this 600 worth of common, there's 600 XDAI in the milestone from the commons. So that
From the funding.
that XDAI from the funding pool has kind of a condition. Exactly, it's conditional money. So it is sitting there in escrow, but it has to be rebonded to the bonding curve. If you rebond it, you get 100% in common stack tokens.
So you get 600 DAI worth of commons tokens.
Like the real default is that you get 600, exactly what Jeff said, you get 600 XDAI worth of common stack tokens, 400 XDAI worth of XDAI, right? You could convert all 1,000 into common stack tokens. You can keep it as 600 common stack tokens and 400 XDAI. Or if you wanted all XDAI, you would need to send the 600 to the common stack bonding curve, to the commons bonding curve, and then get your tokens, and then convert your tokens back into XDAI, paying the exit tribute,
Which is 6.
which is, we're saying 10%, so I don't have to.
So, let me just be very clear though, the UX can be much simpler than this because all of these things can be done atomically, so they can be bundled transactions. So we are describing the information flow about what the business logic is, but to an end user, they're just going to make a simple decision. They're going to see a choice or a slider and be able to make a choice, click a button, and get the results.
And for gas costs on the smart contract side, they will just pay the tax. There will be a query that asks for the tax. They will not be creating common stack tokens and then selling them back. That's just not going to happen.
Okay, so why then?
Yeah, exactly. So the point is, as much as we're going through the logic of this, because this is the sort of mathematics that makes the economy work, we're going to be embedding it away from the end user so that they're making relatively smooth, obvious choices. Like I can have anything between A and B, pick what I want, click a button and done. The fact that it's exercised through this logic is not necessarily a concern to them unless they choose to look into it.
Okay, so why is someone making a proposal for something that is worth or costs $1,000 and they're getting 940 DAI worth of usable tokens out of it?
So they're going to have to keep that into account, just like when you set the price for, you go to a fast food restaurant and they say the dollars are, it costs $3 for a burger. Actually, it costs $3 plus tax.
Okay,
Right.
so when you make your milestone, you have to be calculating tax.
Yeah.
And
That's something that we can put in the description is like, if you take this out and this is funded by the common stack, blah, blah, blah. then you need to add a certain percentage.
I mean,
In-
that's presuming you're taking all your value out of that commons.
Yeah, I mean, in the
That's
end,
the tough part because it seems like
What's
eventually
the full value? And if you don't export the money, you get the full value.
so let me just throw this out there that when you make a Giveth proposal, you have to say what tokens you are willing to accept. So by consenting to accepting this commons tokens, then or like by saying, hey, I want to participate in this commons, you are already assuming that you will be paying this exit tribute.
Okay.
Can I just ask one thing about the commons token though? You said that I can choose the 400x DAI coming from the outside. I could choose to convert them to commons tokens, right?
Sure, why not?
But the function of the commons token is voting. It's voting power.
Yeah.
So if I have real cost of 1,000 for producing something, I probably wouldn't do that. Or do we assume that commons tokens will be on exchanges, will have outside value besides
The commons
voting?
tokens, commons token has a bonding curve. It will not be on outside exchanges because our legal strategy will require us to make it non-transferable. So it won't be on external exchanges, but the bonding curve itself gives it a value, and its value can go up or down. So as someone receiving this, if I have some liquidity myself, then maybe I'm just trying to go clean this river, and like I'm asking for supplies to be paid for supplies I already bought. I don't necessarily need the money right now, and I believe that this river is, it has a lot of value and is undervalued in the current economy. So I think the price of these tokens might go up.
So what I would add to answer the questions that I'm hearing, just to clarify, you always get the full value if you take the internal economy token. So the choice to be taxed is technically a choice because you are you're moving money out of the local economy into the global economy. To Baron's point, we absolutely expect that to happen, but what we want people to do is take out only as much as they actually need to operate, rather than just make a habit of always taking things out. So this tariff, this asymmetry is there so that the natural incentive is to take what you need without putting too much rent on it. We want these to be small, but we want to make sure that people's first preference is to take only what they need and to leave the rest as decision making as a sort of general tendency. And that doesn't mean that they can't. It means that that's the sort of the base incentive field.
There are 2 points that I want to make off of this. Number one, this is not necessarily the same as normal Giveth works right now, where it's like, this is expenses. Well, actually, this is a service. This is a service to this economy, and service providers are expected to take profits. Now, if they take their profits in the common stack token, they don't have to pay the exit tribute. So we're incentivizing them to take their profits in this common stack token. The second point I want to make, which I think is really important, is that these people also, if they are doing one proposal, they will probably have other proposals that they will want to make. And so by holding on to these common stack tokens, they can allocate more funding to their future proposals. So not only do they get to avoid the exit tribute, they also can pull more money. Yeah, they can pull more sway and say, listen, I'm a big part of this economy. I'm helping make this thing go. Like, let's pull more money in my direction so that I can continue to make an impact.
Meritocratic. If you're doing lots of proposals and you're keeping your rewards within the economy, and you have more sway over future proposal votes and funding allocations.
And there's still a secondary control here, though, that you can't just steer it awry, because we are still looking at that yellow bar and saying, if you're not producing real value to the outside world, this does eventually dry up. Because even if you're using your influence you're accumulating, you need there to be money to spend, and the presence of money to spend comes from the fact that what you're actually choosing to produce is valuable to the outside world. So it's essentially a double loop. The first loop is the nervous system, and the outer loop is whether the outside economy values what the nervous system decides to do.
Okay, so I get this incentivization now. Thank you for the explanation. And I do just want to point out that people who make proposals to do work or offer a service for some sort of like community service, social benefit, are already only asking for what they need, right? Like when they make a proposal for something like this, they're not going to factor in like, oh, well, I don't actually need, 90% of this money right now. People of this mindset and culture already are only asking for what they need. So I think it's just something to keep in mind. Like,
I think
user flow wise, like if there's some different way that the 1,000 versus the 940 is presented when you're making a proposal, like
what I would recommend is in the user flows for making proposals that we have a slight guided process that helps people price their proposals, even if it's 2 or 3 screens that says, how much do you actually need to do this? Like, are you planning on taking this in cash? Like, just like, even because the math is very simple, if you give them a mini worksheet that helps them decide, you can get people much more sustainable proposals so that their overall UX is higher, just by saying, oh, okay, you think you need $1,000 in materials, but it's going to take you a few hours and blah, blah, blah. You should propose $250,000, something like that.
Yeah, and when people get paid a salary, they have to pay taxes on their salary at the end of the year, right? Like this is it, and people forget to calculate it. I mean, I think that we will have a lot of work with people that will take it more as a business for the first 2 years, for the first 5 iterations. It's going to stay in the open source space where people expect to pay themselves a salary, and they're more business oriented, before we get to the social impact space where they might be more self-sacrificing. So I think that we will have lots of good solutions for UX before we get there.
A couple questions that I don't want to take too much time. One is more just a comment that's like a follow-up to Lorelai's question and the conversation that's going on right now. I think that sort of some kind of hand-holding mechanism tool is going to be great once we start having users who are not experts in, well, not even experts, users who are not even novices in the blockchain field, right? Who'd maybe, like you said, they know about cleaning up rivers or cleaning beaches. They don't know the first thing about even signing a transaction. I wonder, it would be great to have hand-holding for those kinds of people. I think it would be awesome if there was even a way that like an option, like I just want to ask for money the simplest way, and then we calculate the exit taxes and stuff for them, or like I want to get a little bit granular and choose which token I'm going to receive, etc. Mm-hmm. So that again, in 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, once this is ready for regular people to use, that would be available. Also, you mentioned that these commons tokens are non-transferable. If they have a value that's correlated to the amount of money in the bonding curve on the reserve, is it even possible to speculate on it? Meaning, is it?
Yeah. Okay. So,
why would you speculate on something that I guess for future value, but that if you try to cash it out, you're.
Well, it's kind of like if you have money in the New York Stock Exchange, you can only cash that money out through your stockbroker, right? Like you have one place where you can sell it to,
right? And
it's the same thing for these tokens. You just can't go to Bittrex or even a decentralized exchange. The only place you can sell it to is the bonding curve, and the price, that bonding curve price changes every time someone buys something. So it's
But
constantly changing.
because it's ultimately like because the price of that token is in some way like accountable to the amount that's in the reserve of the bonding curve.
Yeah.
Like maybe I'm missing a speculating opportunity here, but it seems silly to me to when I know that I can only redeem this thing for $5 to buy it for $10 under the expectation that eventually I'll be able to redeem it for 15 or something. You know what I'm saying?
mean that is.
If you made them transferable, like would it even make sense for people to speculate on them?
Yeah, I mean, just like any other stock where there's a friction coming in, or any other token where you have to pay a fee to buy the token.
But the difference is like,
on an
let's say I want
exchange.
to buy Bitcoin or I want to buy Ether, right? There's no inherent value. The only value in that is like what somebody else would eventually pay for it. With this, I can literally like burn the token through a smart contract and then receive DAI or receive Ether or whatever the reserve token is in its place, right? So it does behave differently from other cryptocurrencies in that sense.
Yeah,
Because it's backed by another cryptocurrency, but it's backed nonetheless.
Yeah.
So to me, because it's backed, wouldn't you ultimately think of it in terms of what it's backed by rather than its own potential to fluctuate in value?
Yeah.
That's one of the beautiful things about the system is that the reserve pool and the funding pool are in DAI.
Right.
So when you look at the amount in the funding pool, you say, okay, we have 1 million DAI to allocate to useful projects in this commons. And when you're putting out proposals, say Lorelei says, I have a really great idea. I'm going to put in a proposal for 100,000 DAI. She doesn't have to think, okay, what is the value of Trash Hero coin to DAI today? And halfway through the day, it might change.
Right,
She doesn't have to do that math in her head. She just says, my work is going to cost me 100,000 DAI. This is how you visualize it. But when she's actually paid, she says, hey, I have 10 more proposals coming in this commons. I want to grow my stake and responsibility and token holding. So I'm going to take 100%. She's going to take this slider and go, actually, I want 100%. It's not a marker, but she wants 100% DAI or tokens.
Right,
So her payout is in 100%. Tokens, she is not taxed because all of her value stays in the economy, which is good for the commons economy.
Yeah.
And then her next proposal, she has more weight to vote with.
Yeah.
If instead she says, oh, I'm buying a house, I need all my payment in DAI, she can cash out and she pays the exit tribute. Because we are trying to penalize behaviors that are not useful to the economy. Leaving the economy, leaving the commons is not a useful behavior to the commons. We want to keep as much efficiency and value within the commons as possible.
And that's
So
why
that's
it's
why we're
non-transferable.
introducing it.
It's not really about stopping people from speculating on it, but you just don't want people holding the tokens who don't give a shit about the system itself.
Honestly, it's non-transferable because if it was transferable, it'd be a security, or at least it'd be more likely to be a security. We would be fine with it being transferable.
This entire thing, secondary market, out of the narrative line?
It has to
At some
be.
point, it was in your.
In the original design, they were transferable, but talking with lawyers and wanting to do this, the easiest way possible, we need to start fully decentralized with a non-transferable token. We're not sure yet. We're still working on it. Yeah,
Transferable tokens.
we're still working on those details. I don't know.
And the interesting thing about a secondary market is it would track the index of the bonding curve anyway. So there would just be a continuous arbitrage opportunity. When the price goes above the bonding curve, people would sell. When it goes below, they would buy. So it would just be an arbitrage and it would track the bonding curve.
We don't have much time, but I do really want to go through the iterations of this, and I think that we'll go to. I just want to get this stuff. Sure. So I can probably do it without the whiteboard. When we start with give the first iteration for Giveth for the common stack, the augmented bonding curve field test commons, we will be basically the same as Moloch. When Moloch pays people out, Moloch pays in shares. Those shares, the value of those shares is determined by how much ether is in Moloch. So we'll be doing the same. The common stack, the field test commons, will be sending tokens out to people. The DAO will be sending tokens out. We will,
100%.
yeah, we will very likely, I mean, this isn't 100% certain, but it is that we won't have the Giveth interoperability with the common stack to turn the DAI into common stack tokens at the point of like completing the proposal. We just won't have milestones at all, and in the system, and there will be commons tokens, right? And those commons tokens will be paid to people directly. So like Moloch doesn't have escrow, and for our first iteration, we won't have escrow by default, but we will on the Giveth DApp, we will allow people to send the commons tokens to the Giveth DApp. So we'll add the token to the Giveth DApp, and people can hold the volatile token in escrow, and in our current version of the DApp. And that will not be default behavior. It'll just be an option. In the second iteration, we go into this piece, and we make sure we like guarantee that we will have interoperability so that XDAI can be held in escrow, and that we can incentivize external donations, and that different commons can coordinate on the same milestone. So we'll get the interoperability, and we'll get the accountability, and it'll act as a proposal framework. So for the first iteration, people that want money, they'll just go to an Aragon DAO and create a proposal, and it'll be really bad UX. But in the second iteration, they'll go to Giveth, they'll have a nice proposal like setup, and they can just make it like they would be asking for money on Indiegogo or on Gitcoin. Yeah?
And so presumably, I mean, when you started introducing this like 20 minutes ago or whatever, you were saying that, someone who has a stake in solving one of these problems goes to Giveth. I mean, anyone who was like an early investor in this commons could also go through Giveth and submit proposals too, right?
Absolutely. That's who we expect to be the audience. The audience of the people that are putting money into the hatch are also most likely the people that will be asking for money out of the commons. It's the same people that are funding it that are paying themselves. It's creating a circular economy. But what in the second iteration, we are guaranteeing that we will have this milestone set up, but we're not necessarily including liquid pledging. Liquid pledging is something that we want to include, but it depends on how quickly we raise to the set point of second iteration, because that will take time to do, and that might be out of the scope for the second iteration, but it will be in scope for the third iteration. So liquid pledging is the system that allows people to have the donors on the outside that are like more, this is more like Giveth 2.0 and not necessarily directly related to the common stack. And we will have budget to be working on it, and we will do the full UX overhaul, but we won't actually focus on implementing it until we make sure that this is ready, so that at least there can be this clear escrow system and interoperability system for all the commons. So then the third, fourth, fifth, sixth iterations is just kind of finishing off Giveth 2.0, getting it to be a full working system and infrastructure that's like the equivalent of a Kickstarter type system and or an Indiegogo type system, but specifically for interacting with the common stack, Harburger taxes, or any other of these interesting crypto economic models that can raise funds for things that normally don't have a for-profit economy. Any questions on the iterations? Okay, cool. So
I just wanted to say one other cool thing about using the Giveth as kind of this open Giveth layer is, even if we build this augmented bonding curve and conviction voting system within these commons economies, even if all that fails, we're left with what we have today. all these proposals on an open Giveth layer. So at worst, we're back where we started. There's no like harm to these communities that decide to start launching their commons and their work on this system, even if the bonding curve doesn't work, even if conviction voting doesn't work, which obviously, you know, this is a research experiment. We're going to be trying and failing lots. But at the worst case, we just have a bunch of proposals on Giveth that can still get funded, that the work can still get done.
Yeah, I mean, our easiest comparison is to Moloch. I just submitted a request for Tenegraph in Moloch, right? And no one else gets to see that. No one else gets to fund it. If Moloch decides to fund it, awesome. If Moloch doesn't, well, that's it. It was wasted energy. Here, when someone makes a proposal, if the commons that they expected to get money from doesn't decide to fund it, anyone can fund it, right? Anyone from in the world can fund it. So it's not like, it's like the difference between saying, hey, give me money, to I'm submitting a grant to this specific nonprofit.
Again, that's many commons potentially, right? So if you have an interoperable ecosystem, it might be that a completely different commons other than the one you'd even heard of ends up actually being the one who loves your idea and funds it. And this, it cuts down on the attention strain on the research world and the development world, and anyone who's doing this stuff that wants to be focused on building and not necessarily on fundraising. They're essentially getting a way to not write 15 different grants, but to write one into a community of commons, which obviously is late stage functionality, but it's an important part of modular and sort of decentralized thinking when it comes to communities of communities.
Yeah, so that's Giveth. Let's move to the analytics. Do you want to dive into that?
We want to set up the thing again so you can see it up here.
Okay, Bernd is muted, so I can speak on this one. Can we pull up this screen from me for you guys?
On my computer.
You see me okay?
Let's see.
I don't hear anybody. I'm looking for a confirmation that you see me in the whiteboard.
I mean, it would be better if you
Someone else will have to use
Maybe they're Yes, there we go. Sorry. Double computering. We can hear you now. Confirmation, you can see here.
Yeah.
How about that? Okay.
Hold on. I'm gonna mute.
All right. So what I've drawn on the board here is the general overview of analytics from the perspective of the common stack. This is a little bit orthogonal to the actual system design because analytics are a representation of the system. So what we're going to start with is the actual data feeds themselves. So the lowest level is something that we probably are going to want to build as soon as possible. It's not stage 4 stuff. This is like stuff that needs to be included as soon as we can reasonably do so, because it's about tracking what's happening. What we're talking about in this lowest box is what I'm calling core plumbing. This is essentially the state of the contracts as a database and the understanding that its history of internal transactions is available, although technically they're kind of a pain to unpack. You have to have the contracts to do the decoding. And so what we have in this lowest level is essentially a simplified description of a streaming architecture. In other words, this supports something like a block explorer or basic statistics. So what we normally see in crypto projects right now is a somewhat hacky version of this flow, generally with some kind of graph database here, providing a backend to some what I would call traditional microdata analytics. In other words, doesn't really tell you much besides summary statistics and the ability to blow out raw data because it doesn't have a systemic model. But you still always need to start here. And so one of the questions that we have in the roadmap actually is, how quickly and how MVP do we get from core plumbing to essentially streaming infrastructure, which is just grabbing the new state and grabbing the whatever transactional data we decide we want to stream into a cloud-based backend. And traditionally, you can do this one of two ways. One is to do like deep flat file storage with large servers and like basically do business level analytics, or we can have this process be, relatively reducing and only computing and streaming the statistics into this backend that we actually want to show. And we would expect this to be necessary as UI1, just in the same way that anyone would expect a block explorer. So I'm not counting this as level 4 stuff, but this is modular because the same thing is going to become incredibly important for our higher grade analytics. So from an analytics perspective, we have to start with the when and how should we get our primary data collection, structuring, and statistics up and running so that people who want to see provenance, who want to understand what's going on, can drill down and look around. We are not necessarily demanding that anyone do this, but it is necessary from a transparency perspective to say like, hey, turns out reading data from smart contracts is a pain in the ass. Let's provide a way of giving access to it. And my argument for this would be, we don't necessarily have to, overdo it in terms of servers. We just need to provide some code that allows other people to instance this. So it would basically mean, yeah, okay, we're running a light block explorer with this. Again, it's probably not that light if we want to have a lot of data, but we don't need to assume that everyone's going to come to us for this. We need to make it easy for anyone to do this. And that's what I'm going to call layer 1. And we have to talk about how and when this gets done because it's traditional, not advanced. Now, the stuff that we're talking about that's really special about the common stack is that currently missing from most blockchain projects is system level view. In other words, information about system health and understanding not just about the statistics, but about like the character of the system. And so with CAD-CAT, we can build these business logic differential equations. They represent the way the system evolved because we know the logics, because we did this biomimetic design, we have these algorithms, the bonding curve, the conviction voting, the Giveth DApp logic. We're able to create models of the system as a whole. Think of it like your airplane has a navigation system. It doesn't use the whole airplane. It uses a representation of what flying an airplane is to steer, actually. And that thing sends instructions down a level and it can read data from down a level. But these CAD-CAD models are at the level of ecosystem sort of, we call them digital twins. The first one that we're gonna want is already a rough draft. It's the thing that we've been using for our prototyping. And as we refine it, what we would do is wrap it in a microservice and use it for something called state estimation. State estimation is when you take these statistics and you lay them into the system model, and then you can describe the state of the system based on interpreting this data using the system model, and that allows you to do projections. And projections are just basically saying, like, here's where I am today, here's how the system is currently evolving, here's where, where I see it going in the future. And that is usually something that allows for some interactivity. But this block here isn't actually the interactivity or the UX. This is a microservice that runs in a Docker container that gives you an input-output mapping. It says, if you give me some data and run through this model, I will give you some more data. And we can put that up here. And so we'll have this data and logic to interpret it to do these system health focused analytics. And while we haven't gotten too deeply into it, much of the project work that I've done with block science actually revolves around what are the system health metrics of a particular ecosystem. And this is ongoing work, likely with the narrative and comms teams, because this is a form of data-driven communication for the purpose of improving the health of the commons itself. It's a feedback system for humans. And so this has to be human-centric. And that's why I'd say it's macro, it's high level. You want to understand how the whole system is doing in order to potentially make new proposals, etc. Note that this is essentially a drill down. So this is telling you that you're on track, that things are working well in a much more yes, the heading of my starship is going the right direction, not the engines are burning at 100 and whatever, doesn't matter. But that doesn't mean that if you have questions here, you shouldn't be able to click through to here. Now, the reason why this one is 4 and I put this at 5, 6 is that this one essentially represents best practices today with our capabilities using CAD and high quality data. And this one represents what we're currently working on, which is called system identification. The difference between state estimation and system identification is that state estimation says the system works like this and here's the state it's in, project. System identification uses machine learning not to learn the current state of the system, but the nature of the system. So what's parameterized here is how it works, not the condition it's in. So this can still use machine learning, but it's essentially saying this is the condition the system is in. This says this is the condition the system is in, and here's how the system works. So it's 2 levels of machine learning. And this is more in line with what's done in robotics control, aerospace, and defense. And so what's exciting for me is that the existence of CAD makes this possible, even though it's not currently practiced in data science. That's this. So we want to be doing this in 4 and using it to produce our health metrics and our high-level visibility. And then in our next stage, we're basically going to be versioning from here to here and essentially basically doing more advanced AI. Ultimately, this is probably the same dashboards, but they are richer. They can have more features. We can explore what kind of UX we want. But the most important thing about this whole architecture is that it's modular. It's plumbing. It's traditional analytics. It's CAD 1, CAD 2, and it's this system health sort of holistic analytics. And we can build it basically here. This is already in the works. It's what our prototype is based on. And then we can go from here to here, and then we can iterate by going from here to here. And then the last thing I want to say about this is that while this is technically a server-based architecture, the point of doing it this way is that it should be instanceable, meaning you shouldn't require people to come to some common stack central server to look up this stuff. We should be providing an open source code base that allows someone to deploy something like this to their own infrastructure themselves. And obviously that's a question about development, deployment, and ultimately distribution. We can start this by building it ourselves, with as long as we are taking the tack that it's designed not to be owned and operated by us, but rather we are an operator of one of these, and that we actually encourage people to instance their own with their own commons. So we might make one of these for the commons that we launch, but in general, we would actually expect people who launch their own commons to launch their own instance of one of these in support of their own commons. So that's the big overview of analytics. You can kind of think of it as being in a parallel dimension to the real system. It's got its own software architecture. It's a representation of the system, and it's interacting primarily through the data feeds into it. Then it produces information. That information is consumed by participants so that they can be more informed. And one of the most important aspects of this is that these expose nonlinearities and feedback effects, because it is very common in complex systems for the naive interpretation of how to fix a problem to be opposite intent, or like have the opposite effect, because there's feedback. And so what you need to be able to say is, suppose I make some changes in my commons, or suppose I want to do something, what would happen if I did that? And the kinds of UIs that we're talking about in this advanced analytics are like these A/B tests. And those are things that are supported in the feature space of CAD for one to say, okay, here's how things are. What would it look like if I changed something? And that type of sort of A/B test is required to inform human decision-making, precisely because humans will often misassess those things, but we still want them to make the decision. So we want to give them the tools to inform themselves about their own decisions. And so this is essentially a design for the minimum viable decision support system for a community to self-manage without devolving into bullshit politics and arguing over things that no one actually knows the answer to.
So, oh yeah, go ahead.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So my question is, how easy will it be to build in different types of data input? Like is it a fixed set of different types of data that will be able to be put into this analytics system? Like, for example, like, okay, say, you know, in the beginning we know that how many people are voting on proposals is a great indicator of like the financial success of the commons years down the line. And that's like an analytic point that we can like model, and that's a part of this system, right? You can like input how many people are voting in each proposal, and it'll give you a prediction of like how long your commons will last, whatever. But what if, like, say then, you know, a couple years down the road, you find out that actually what's even more indicative is how frequently people are voting and how likely, you know, each individual is to vote again and again on different.
So the answer is about
and that's a better indicator. Are you able to easily build, hang on. Are you able to easily build that new type of data point into the system, like as someone who's deploying it yourself?
So the answer is this depends on how you manage the core plumbing. The way that people are currently doing this is often very reduced. So the data architecture at this level, the sort of data models that you use to represent things, how rich and how complete they are a limiting factor on what you can do further up. So if you take this level and you don't overly suppress it to basically people do MVP graph database things where they capture what they think they're going to need, that will become a limiter for all future stuff. But if you start more foundationally here and you capture the sort of data in a more holistic way, so more data, richer data in the streaming layer, then you have the ability to compute and basically do lots of different stuff. But you have to invest intellectually upfront in this layer if you want flexibility in the future about those higher levels.
And when you say you, does that mean the way that Block Science is going to build this, or the way that each person deploys the open source code?
Actually, specifically, I mean the design of the system per common. So Block Science here, and whoever we subcontract to work on this, because this is some of the things that Griff and I have been talking about. There are teams that have some experience in this layer that want to participate. So we'll have to like figure out the best way to get it done. But whoever does this, whether I'll be doing design work with Block Science, and then execution work will be done with, you know, whichever teams that we all decide are the right way to get it done right. But what we're talking about is something that is abstract in the sense that we want to minimize the amount where our decisions up front limit our future choices about things like system health. So a good design here will be sufficiently rich and sufficiently like organized that it provides a big data layer, essentially, which is in turn the fodder or the input to a large class of potential refined data goods. And so the reason why I broke this out this way is because right now the common practice in crypto is to do this very minimalist in order to serve a handful of pre-specified things on the left here. And what I'm saying is if you just do this, you'll run into exactly the problem you're describing, that refactoring for some new thing is going to be hard and potentially a massive amount of rework. If you invest in the way that you build this part, then while you still might show the same summary statistics here, when you start going through these layers and iterating on these things, you have a lot more degrees of freedom to learn from the data and change what you show and how you show it and what you view as important and valuable.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, so I guess it's very important then that the people and the project that we select, that it's a project that is very collaborative in that sense, and that will give you a lot of input. Like, this is what we want to do, and that you like constantly go back and forth, so that that basic layer gets as much data points as possible.
And just to be clear, Griff, I remember when you met Josh in Berlin a year-ish ago. So what Josh was working on before he started developing the CAD framework was actually parts of this. So his background is also in distributed computing in this sort of centralized sense, works with Apache Spark and other tools. And so we had already done some prototyping, and we have some code base for pulling data directly out of Ethereum nodes and cleaning and streaming and organizing it. It's not, final state work, but it's far enough along. It's several months of prototyping and R&D. So when it comes to working with people, it won't be just throw it over the wall and say, figure it out. We'll be talking about best practices for this, and we'll have some code base to work from as a starting point. But to be clear, there's a non-trivial, like what I'll call cross-disciplinary thing happening, or not disciplinary, but cross-silo thing here happening, where you're essentially putting a node from a blockchain network, or whether it's a POA network, or where the data is coming from, or whether it's Ethereum, or it doesn't matter. The point is, you have to run inside of a worker, inside of a distributed computing environment, in order to do the kind of streaming that you would want to do if you're going to pull large data. And there is an issue with what you want to store in a lightweight backend for specific analytics versus what you might keep in flat file storage, which is cheaper. And so, again, I think it's a little too detailed for now, but my point here is that analytics in the context of an ecosystem is not like a one and done thing. It's got infrastructure, it's got UIs, and it's got models. And this is essentially data engineering, this is AI and data science, and this is like UX and decision support. And so those projects are going to be, multi-team, collaborative, very human-driven, but the architectures need to be modular enough that we can have multiple teams working on it, and that other people can use them, instance them, make changes themselves without having to deal with a monolith.
Did that answer your question, Chris?
Yeah, in a way. I guess it's to me again a confirmation that you really will have to find teams that are that much into it and that are really into data analytics. Otherwise, they'll be like, "Wow, this is not so important," and they will come with you to the questions once you already built that basic these first elements.
Yeah, I think this is part of the reason why I've been saying these teams might not actually come from the crypto space. The crypto side of this isn't actually very hard comparatively, because if you have a distributed computing background, the idea of spinning a peer-to-peer node inside of a worker node is not really that unreasonable. So it's actually, the limiting factor is going to be the experience with these tools, not necessarily with these. And so as we proceed, the teaming is going to be a collaboration, but we're also going to be jumping across boundaries and reaching out to and finding people from other communities with different expertises from what's currently being deployed in pursuit of various other blockchain projects.
Can I just jive off that for a second? Well, just really quick, on exactly what Zargham said. When we're picking our field test commons, the first 3 are very likely to be very blockchain centric. Maybe the 4th one as well. The 5th one, where we're starting to implement some of this, that would be a great time to kind of venture out into more of a data science layer. And then the 6th one, it will be more of like someone who's doing real nonprofit work. Maybe it will be open source hardware, but ideally it will be someone who's actually trying to help a river or something like that. But we will get to choose the subject matter and the communities that we build this for, or at least we will get to influence the Hatch token holders, the tech token holders, on which one.
And I think it's worth saying as well that a lot of this complexity will be abstracted away as we move through these iterations. This is not the data analytics layer that will be used by a commons to clean a river. They're not going to be looking at this layer. They're going to be it's an analytics package.
Yeah,
okay, but that's exactly my question, because we explained until now, we explained like the commons, the people will clean the river. Okay, so to me, I don't see where this really fits into the target group or into the concept overall. So I still don't understand. Is this a system that we use to work on a bonding curve and on token economics specifically? Or is this a tool that I can really use if I want to create, if I fork the common stack DAO and I create my own commons, can I use this to simulate how can I make better clean air? Something like that. Just a very simple question.
Yes and no. That depends entirely on whether the person who's making the instance is investing in building a representation of the system they're working on. So what we've described here can tell you the health of the commons. If that commons is, say, cleaning a river, that's their only thing, and it's all just proposals related to that cleaning that river, this can tell you about the sort of rates of funding and the uniqueness of the different people, and you can build something that shows you what we would call the business analytics of that nonprofit community, which they could use to make decisions, but it doesn't necessarily provide them analytics about the river. If you wanted to bring things up to that level, that would require someone to build a CAD model, not of the commons, but of the thing the commons is working on.
And you need oracles that give you information.
Exactly. And actually, just to be clear though, I have some ongoing collaborations and discussions with IXO and a few other organizations that are working on real systems. And so we are talking about making digital twins of the system that we designed, but anyone who is further working on a system with data can have other data feeds. So I've described this as data from our contract states, but in general, this is from any sources that are well-defined. And then these models can be any models that operate on that data, and these front ends can be any front ends that answer questions that can be resolved from the combination of the data feeds and the model. Everything is basically just data plus model plus the sort of AI layer tasks leads to some UX and decision support. But you need to basically be able to check all of these boxes. Where does my data come from? Do I have a good model? Do I have the right machine learning and AI workflows to combine the two? And given what I produce from that, do I know what decisions I'm supporting and what UX I need to support it? And this total workflow is valid for any project, but we're not necessarily providing it beyond the management of the nonprofit as though it were a communal business or a co-op.
No, so I think we really have to see, because yesterday Max started with the persona, and I think that's where I really don't see where this fits into the personas.
So, Baron, how about I put it this way? If you're investing in Google, you want to know how Google is performing. You want to know what they're doing, what they're spending their time on, what they're spending their budget on. You want to see their graphs. You want to see their burn rate, then you invest. This is an analytics dashboard for a commons. If you're going to say, okay, I believe in cleaning up this river, but there are 4 commons that are cleaning up this river, and I want to compare which commons, is spending which one has the most effective proposals, which one is spending their money most sustainably, which one is, the feedback from the commons into how that work is getting done that will affect your decision on which one you want to join and how you want to work in those commons. Maybe you want to work in
that. No, I totally understand that, but that's not part of this because that's external data we don't actually take into consideration right now. So to me, this is a very token economics based solution because it works on a lot of these things. A lot of data comes from transactions. And this is like internal data, like the blockchain specific information. It's not external information right now. So I think that's exactly the point I'm.
That's what tells you. I mean,
yeah.
It's like, okay, how much money do we have in the funding pool? How many people are voting? What's the voter apathy rating? What's the, all of these things are actually very important that you would want to know before you invest in a commons, before you decide to buy tokens inside of a system. You want to understand briefly how these things.
It's absolutely. It's a great tool for investors to see how does this community work. Is it maybe more centralized? Is there only one person really active in this, and he's doing great stuff, or is this really a community? And I want to invest because I believe more people is more opportunities, whatever. So this is to me we really have to be clear on the target group. And this is for investors, definitely.
It's not just for investors. I will say that I think that it's important to understand that there's sort of decisions, then there's outcomes, and then there are proposals. And let's imagine that people are, as a community, a group, the participants, they want to understand the way that this is working, this flow process. So it is still fundamentally a economics exercise. It is telling you the health of this circular economy, but what we're basically saying is that this thing is an engine for producing, whatever we're going to call value. And we're expecting this to be something that's sort of fuzzy in the outside world for now. But what we have is the loop that you're talking about is sort of the meta loop, which is this outside world perceives value and results in more money, which we don't have visibility in this analytics to this unless we further built another layer for that. This is modular enough that that's plausible, but this is bespoke. It's commons dependent. And so the extent to which we add things for this loop can only be determined much later. But architecturally, it's plausible. But what we can do that is in everyone is this part. We're saying, well, this circular economy is structurally the same as long as you follow the pattern we gave you, and we can show you how this is working. And again, this is macro in the sense that we're saying you could have probably always gone through and dug through this data, but probably you don't care. And what you should know is just like, hey, it's working. There are dozens of people participating regularly. And when we get to the CAD discussion later, I'll show you guys the prototypes of this system that we're working on, and we can talk more about personas and about use cases. But my feeling here is that the primary audience is initially actually first the mahouts, or whoever the people who are the stewards of this commons, and their job is to make sure that that circular economy is healthy and to answer and ask questions like, is it working as intended? Do I need to change something? And think of it as a meta adaptation layer that supports governance of the commons. And this is necessary for that. But we want that to be decentralized, which means we need to not have this be something that only an expert who really gets it can deal with. By escalating it to this level, we're saying, if you care, you can understand. You don't have to, but you can. As long as this workflow is limited to people who can go and do it themselves, there's a lack of decentralization purely in essentially the technocrat problem. Yeah. Only someone with the skills to be informed can participate, which heavily biases the opinions that are actually determining decisions.
Kai had something.
I just want to finish up on last comment I have on that. I think this is a great system, and it's absolutely amazing that we can build this. And to me, it's not very specific for the commons. That's the only thing I want to sort of point out, that we shouldn't. We need to be sure that we define the target group very precisely, and because to me, this is token economics is a great topic for this. As an example, if we want to show people how powerful it is. And even in the comments that we built, the token economics is the bonding curve, for example. That would be something that you can sort of adjust through this, in my opinion. But maybe I'm not getting this still correctly. But to me, it really is important that we don't say, yes, you can clean your river, and this gives you sort of a good overview of how you're doing in that. So that's the only thing I'd say.
If you created a dam in that river, then you would want this analytics software to make sure that the tool that you're using for that next to that river is working well.
So if I step
and
back, let's think about this in terms of DGov instead of token economics. Well, this is technically what people would call token economics or token engineering work. I would say that it is actually much more important from a DGov perspective, because what we're doing is decentralizing the information necessary to inform decisions. So this is operational decisions. So again, we're talking about a community or a co-op or a nonprofit. We're trying to avoid a scenario where only a very small number of people are informed enough to make recommendations on how to govern that thing. And so while this is very general, it's general on purpose because it's meant to encode the best practices in business management of a thing that spends money and makes decisions. Like a thing that spends money and makes decisions needs to be managed by humans at some level. And what we want is to make sure that the humans doing this are whoever feels as though they want to participate in that, not only the people who can hack through all the bullshit down to this level. And so what we're doing is making something that is aiming at decision-making inclusion in an informed way, because you don't want to include people just to include them, because the fact is that uninformed influences actually make operations harder and worse. But we're not trying to say, screw you, you don't get to participate. We're saying that puts a burden on us to make it as easy as possible to be informed. So I would put it in the DGov category more than I would put it even in the token economics category.
So I just want to give a little. I just basically want to support Steve here with saying this is very important stuff. Even for the end user, like everybody uses analytics all the time to really make decisions. Unfortunately, those are mostly not the kind of free analytics. They can be skewed and changed by the provider. One thing about blockchain is that a blockchain should have a state that is unfalsible. So we get back to these like very nice data sets that should not have bias.
To be able to start again, Kai?
What? Yeah, I just wanted to say that it's very important for the end user, even if some of us don't see it yet. And on the other hand, it's not that hard to implement. Like analytics, you can really start from one data point and go from there, and it can be on your first day of coding. And it is really very important. Maybe Bernd, look at how often you see analytics in your life in the coming days, and if you use them to make decisions, but it's becoming very normal now. And other than that, I feel always if the really, really successful applications, they use a lot and they use them greatly. And yeah, I'm really a new fan of this type of thinking.
I have a question, unless we're still in the middle of another question. We were kind of jarbled for a little bit.
5-minute warning.
Yeah, no, I just had a quick clarification because I think this is a really useful part that may have been glossed over. So Z, do you still have the thing up on your screen? Yeah. So you mentioned in the CAD V2, is that a completely different, like that's a completely refactored tool, or is that just like additional functionality for the analytics?
It's versioning. So it remains to be seen how big this jump ends up being. Consider the thing that I have already prototyped is the rough draft of this. It's still got a lot of work, but that's why we recruited Ravi and we're working on it here. The idea though is that, you know, we need to have this is a modular architecture. We need to have a model in order to have a model-driven UI. And number 4 is just going to be based on what we sort of know that we can do now. And the ongoing research that we're doing is expanding this capability into this capability. And so the way that I imagine doing this is deploying the more mature capability in version 4, and then deploying the more advanced capability in 5, 6, depending on how the roadmap falls out.
So my question is regarding like system identification. We can have like A/B testing of how a certain decision would propagate through the system and result in a different.
That's possible in both, but it'll depend on the feature set of the analytics, because it's the CAD models themselves, regardless of whether they have system identification or not, have A/B testing in the feature set for the CAD engine. But it comes back to the fact that those are like experiments that have to run. So if you want to run an A/B test, you might actually have to tell it to run it and then wait for the answer. Or then there are other questions about what infrastructure is running it. And so there's technical implementation considerations related to time, UX, what's supported, and a lot of that's going to come up to this. And so I actually think that a really big part of the analytics dashboard is not even going to be implementation details. It's going to be modeling, health metrics. That's the reason why I sent you those other docs to review from other projects on health metric design. Because back to Lorelai's point, it's not like a given. Those are subjective choices. So we need to be learning continuously about what is actually helpful to end users. And that's what brings us to this level. And it's also one of the reasons why I pulled Max Kudnov in, because he's been working with me on sort of how to make this to this usable for a person.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Thank you.
And just to confirm, will all this be like open copyleft kind of licensing, like GPL v3?
Yeah. So these things, the ones for the commons. My expectation is that that code should be open because we want people to instance it. I may have to look at the way that like I'm also going to have, if you think of this as a architecture that's composed of components and that the components are classes, then all of the instances of this are going to be open. One of the open questions for me though is some of the at some level, I have to figure out what's IP that I need to keep for building, not just for building products, but for instances that aren't instances of these things that aren't the public ones, right? Because we're also building these for clients. So it has to be like managed at the level of the instances for the commons are open. Some of the generators and the classes and the capabilities will be open, but there will always be some instances of this stuff that belong to someone.
Yeah. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Okay, so we need to take a 10-minute break and then come back for a really short thing about the iterations, and then dive into augmented bonding curves. So 10-minute break.
Okay.
See you guys at 10:50. Nice work, Z. That was great, man.